Top 6 Nutrients to Prevent Leg Cramps in Seniors. Strengthen your legs. On a worn wooden chair on the porch of his home in Asheville, North Carolina, where the Appalachian Mountains hug the sky, Walter, 78, sat quietly watching the sunset stretch across the valley. Beside him was an old walker, which he joked had been his most loyal companion since his 70th birthday. But today, Walter could no longer smile. A week ago, he had gotten a cramp while getting up to get a glass of water. The spasm was so sudden, it felt like someone had squeezed his calf with their bare hands. Walter had fallen flat on the kitchen floor. Just a cramp, but it had left him with 4 hours in the hospital, a bruised leg, and, more importantly, a vague fear of impending helplessness. Walter was a former physical education teacher. He jogged every morning in a park along the French Broad River, taught hundreds of kids how to play basketball, mowed his own yard, and drove around the southern United States with his wife. But now, even a slight pain in his leg made him wonder, how long did he have left to walk before everything had to happen? In bed? When his daughter, Julia, a senior nurse in Boston, heard, she didn't let it go. She flew back to Asheville that weekend carrying not medicine but a strange list. The 6 most important nutrients to help Dad keep his legs healthy, fight cramps, and ease his pain every day. Julia knew what was happening to her father, like so many of the elderly patients she had cared for. She knew that change starts with the smallest thing, nutrition. But with just 6 nutrients, can Mr. Walter change the future of his legs? And more importantly, are you, the person watching this video, ignoring something important that is making your legs weaker and weaker without knowing it? Don't look away, because this journey isn't just Walter's story. It could be your story, or the story of a parent, aunt, uncle, or loved one who lives with you every day. Before we get started on this journey of discovery, if you have also experienced leg cramps, numbness, muscle weakness, or difficulty walking, leave a comment below sharing your story. Who knows, you might inspire someone. And if you find this content useful, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on the next stories. Protein, meals, and self-esteem in old age. Outside the frosted glass windows, the red and orange leaves of the Appalachian fall silently fell onto the cobblestone walkway. The sky seemed to be draped in a thin layer of silver silk, evoking a nostalgic and chilly feeling. In the warm kitchen with its soft yellow light, the clatter of knives, the bubbling of water, were ordinary sounds, but to Mr. Walter, they reminded him of something more distant, a happiness that had once been present, but now seemed far away. He walked into the kitchen, not in a hurry, not decisively. Each step was deliberate, not because he was hungry, but because he was tired, a quiet, unnoticeable tiredness that crept into every joint of his knee, every movement of his foot. "I think it's oatmeal and boiled eggs for breakfast," Julia said, her voice light as air, holding out 2 small bowls, one for him, one for her. On the table, steaming oatmeal, perfectly halved eggs, a few slices of butter, and fresh strawberries. Walter sat down in the chair, not looking at his daughter. His eyes fell on the bowl of oatmeal as if he saw a silent protest. "Just muffins. Dad has been eating them for over 20 years. His voice was not angry, but hard. It carried the firmness of a former breadwinner who once said, "Every morning it takes a strong cup of coffee, a pastry, and 10 minutes of silence to put the world in order." Julia sat across from him, not arguing. She placed her hand lightly on the back of his hand. "Dad, I didn't make this meal for you to eat your fill. It's to keep the person you used to be." Elderly wisdom, when we are no longer ourselves. The words made something inside him sink. For a moment, Walter saw himself at 40 years old. Standing in the middle of the backyard of his old house in South Carolina, his wife Helen lifted off the ground, both of them laughing loudly to the sound of watering plants. She put her arms around his neck and whispered, "Don't ever let me grow old." Yet last year, the day she died of complications from diabetes, Walter himself couldn't stand up after kneeling beside her coffin. His knees shook, his body shook. No one noticed, but to him it felt like an incomplete goodbye. He had let old age get the best of him, just when he needed to stand up the most. He bent down and slowly picked up the spoon, not because he was forced, not because he was hungry, but because he remembered why he was strong and wanted to hold on to some of that. Protein. Not for athletes, but for those who want to continue living properly. Julia knew well, at 78, what was weakening her father was not just illness, but a silent deficiency of something most seniors take for granted: protein. You know, Julia began, her voice low as if she were telling a story, when your body lacks protein, it doesn't just make your muscles thinner. It makes your steps weaker, makes your knees wobble when you stand up, makes you dizzy when you climb stairs. That's not natural aging, it's a warning, she explains. After age 60, the body loses 1 to 2% of its muscle mass each year. It's called sarcopenia, a painless but insidious process. And every year that passes, without enough protein, especially the leucine-rich kind like eggs, milk, and fish, the body no longer has the raw materials to repair itself. It's like a bridge with a broken foundation. Every day it's not repaired, it gets more likely to collapse, Julia said. And the cramps, the pain Dad gets every night, are the first creaks in that bridge. New life and the meal of self-esteem. From that day on, Walter began to eat breakfast regularly, not out of obligation, but as a ritual to maintain dignity. Each meal has at least 25 to 30 grams of protein: hard-boiled eggs, smoked salmon, cottage cheese, Greek yogurt. When he has a poor appetite, Julia uses protein powder mixed with bananas and chia seeds. When his teeth hurt, she makes mashed pea soup with egg whites. Walter began to feel different. Every morning he no longer needed to hold onto the table when he stood up. Each step seemed easier. The night cramps became less frequent, then disappeared. One last sentence, lingering in the gaze between father and son. One evening, as they sat looking at Walter and Helen's wedding photos, he whispered, "You know, I used to think I was getting weaker with age, but that's not true. I was getting weaker because I let myself become hollow from the inside." Julia squeezed her father's hand. "It's never too late to put some strength back into the void, Dad, as long as you eat oatmeal and eggs every morning." They both laughed, and for the first time in years, Walter actually laughed, without shaking hands, without hunching back, without half-laughing. But one morning, as Walter was making himself breakfast, something he hadn't done in 5 years, he felt a sharp pain in his calf. This time, it wasn't from a lack of protein, it was from something else, something that had been quietly swelling up in his blood vessels every day: inflammation. And that's when Julia introduced him to her new friend, omega-3. Early spring in suburban Vermont is usually uneventful. Boisterous, except for the cold, still mornings, as if everything had just been born from a thick fog that blanketed the porch. Julia sat with her father, Walter, in the old kitchen, where the sunlight was just warm enough to dispel the chill on the handle of the teapot. There was no more nighttime scream that morning, no more soft moans from the bedroom across the hall. It was one of those rare mornings when Julia woke up on time, not because she was worried about her father, but because of the alarm clock, not the pained sound of Walter softly calling her name. She poured tea, gently as always, then opened a leather notebook, the father care diary that Julia had started writing in the month before. "Does your calf still hurt?" she asked. He shook his head, no words needed. His eyes answered. They were the eyes of a man who had not slept well for a long time, now waking up from a peaceful night, like when he was young, not yet aware of the terrible pain of 3 a.m. contractions. Julia smiled, then began to explain, not with cold medical theory, but in a language that her father, a retired watchmaker, could understand from the bottom of his heart. "Imagine this, Dad. In your leg, there are millions of muscle fibers like piano strings. When you're young, they're smooth and flexible, but over time the soft tissues around them get a little inflamed. A slow inflammation, like running out of oil." She placed her hand on his, soft, warm, patient. "And then, just a slight movement while sleeping, those strings tighten, and you know what happens." Walter said nothing, but his face fell. He saw himself, like the old piano in the workshop, rusty strings, clattering keys, once loud, now dull, untuned, untouched. He was that piano. Julia continued, her voice warm, as if telling a childhood story. The fish oil I give you every morning has two important ingredients, EPA and DHA. They are good fats that reduce inflammation, soften muscles, increase circulation, and soothe nerves. If your body were an old guitar, then omega-3 would be the repairman, lubricating each string, softening each key. No surgery, no painkillers. No, just regular daily doses, and one day you'll be able to sleep without being woken up by your own body. She stopped, looked deep into his eyes. Walter didn't need to understand all the scientific research, but he felt one thing. His daughter's worry was real, and his pain was real too. It wasn't his imagination. It was the alarm bell of old age. Not an invitation to death, but a warning that if you don't change, no one else will. So for the first time in years, Walter took the initiative to open the medicine cabinet without being reminded, without being forced. He picked up the tiny fish oil capsule Julia had prepared, a soft gel, amber in color like a drop of honey, and swallowed it as an act of his own free will. As a promise, not to Julia, but to his own aging body. I will not let it fall again. The nights are not long anymore. There is something rarely said. Old people do not fear death. They fear the long, sleepless nights, nights when the ticking clock reminds them, you are getting old, you are getting weaker, and you are no longer in control. People say cramps are a small thing, but for Mr. Walter and millions of other seniors, it was the moment they suddenly realized, this body no longer belongs to me. Omega-3 is no miracle, but it is a quiet companion. A little each day, it helps reduce swelling in the knees, increases circulation in the calves, warms cold feet at night, and gently covers the insecurities of old age like a thin blanket. Julia didn't stop at fish oil pills. She quietly changed her father's weekly menu. The dishes were cooked with care and love. Pan-seared salmon with lemon garlic dill sauce, a dish he used to only eat at restaurants. Grilled sardines with watercress sprouts. Julia calls it a meal of memories. Herring soup with mashed potatoes, a dish her mother used to cook for him. She cooked it again as a memory recall. 1 month later, Julia wrote in her brown notebook, Day 30, noticed changes in Dad. No more cramps in the middle of the night, warmer feet, no more numbness. Wake up early, walk in the garden without having to rest, and most importantly, no more crying in the dark. Omega-3s didn't cure everything, but they gave Walter something more valuable than medicine, the belief that he still had the power to do something for himself. And for Julia, she understood that. Loving an old person is not about taking care of them like a child. It is about helping them remember that they can still take care of themselves, with pride. Remember, aging isn't about the body. It's about giving up control over yourself. And sometimes, just one omega-3 capsule each morning is all it takes to rekindle that spark of control. Magnesium, the silent nutrient that revives vitality. As Julia gently set the pot of geraniums down on the porch, she saw her father stop. Not from his knee, not from the familiar cramp, but from a completely new sensation, dizziness, shortness of breath, a haze over his vision. Are you okay, Dad? Julia quickly supported him, her eyes full of worry. Walter blinked. Then he nodded, but something was clearly wrong. He had thought that when his legs stopped hurting, when his knees stopped creaking, his body would return to normal. But he had forgotten one thing. The human body was not a machine, but a symphony. Every part, every function, needed to be nourished equally to create a harmonious piece of music. Julia helped him into a sitting position on the couch. Her hand squeezed his gently, warm but weaker than usual. Do you know why your body can no longer hurt, but you still feel weak? Mr. Walter looked up at his daughter as if waiting for an answer. Because the fuel in the father cell is running out. You mean sugar? No, it's magnesium. Magnesium, not just for sleep, but for life. Julia pulled out an old medical notebook, placed it gently on her father's knee, and opened it to a page marked with yellow post-it note. Magnesium, the silent spark. Magnesium is a mineral that Dad never paid much attention to, but it is involved in more than 300 biochemical reactions in the body, especially the process of creating energy in each cell. Without magnesium, a cell is like a light bulb without a wire. She explains, not in technical terms, but with pictures. I think of a muscle cell as a room. Inside that room is a machine that produces energy, called a mitochondria. But for the machine to work, it needs electricity. Magnesium is that electricity. Without magnesium, the machine is still there, but it doesn't work. That's why, even though my knees don't hurt anymore, I still feel tired, weak, and wobbly when I lift heavy objects. Walter nodded. He felt like himself these days, more alert, less sore, but tired, more exhausted. Gone were the violent cramps, replaced by a dull ache, as if his body had weathered a storm, only to drift into a parched desert. Magnesium, key for blood vessels, muscles, nerves. Julia wasn't exaggerating. She walked her father through the specific effects of magnesium. It helps muscles relax after each contraction, preventing cramps more effectively than calcium. It stabilizes heart rate, regulates blood pressure, helping the brain not to be overwhelmed by poor blood circulation. It reduces nervous tension and supports deep sleep because magnesium is a cofactor in the natural production of melatonin. And most importantly for the elderly, it keeps energy metabolism uninterrupted. See, Julia said, pouring a glass of water and dropping in a magnesium citrate tablet. The water bubbled gently, as if life were awakening each old cell. Okay. Magnesium does not need to be injected, just understood and maintained. Like omega-3 or collagen, magnesium doesn't work overnight, but little by little, day by day, it restores confidence in your own body. And for older people, it's the greatest power. Walter started adding magnesium to his daily diet, not just with pills, but with natural foods prepared by Julia. Crispy roasted pumpkin seeds, a snack for afternoon reading. Sautéed spinach with garlic, side dish for dinner. Avocado and crushed almonds, served on whole wheat bread in the morning. And sometimes a cup of pure, unsweetened cocoa, rich in natural magnesium, warm and aromatic, like memories of youth. 1 week later, change is not about magic, it's about small choices. Walter was no athlete, but he no longer sat panting as he walked from the kitchen to the backyard. He could lift a light potted plant, put away old books, and even read the morning paper without having to stop because of dizziness. You know, he said, standing in front of the mirror one morning, I didn't expect that the change wouldn't start with my body, but with the moment I heard you explain it honestly. Julia said nothing. She just smiled, then wrote in her diary. Day 43. Dad no longer sits around in the morning, walks for 25 minutes without stopping. Realizes vitality doesn't come from supplements, it comes from perseverance. Omega-3 helps reduce inflammation and restore flexibility. Collagen heals connective tissue. And magnesium awakens energy, awakens dormant vitality. Each nutrient does not work alone, but is a silent teammate, connecting, protecting, and supporting a body that seems to have fallen apart. If you're caring for a parent or entering those less hurried years yourself, start small. No big changes needed, no magic pill needed. Just believe that old age is not the end, but a rewritten chapter with understanding, with choice, and with love. Glucosamine, lubricant for old hinges. That evening, the air suddenly turned cold after a mild sunshine. Walter was bending down to water some heather on the porch when he heard a clack, a sound so small it was like the wind gently shaking the roof tiles. But he knew it was coming from his right knee. No pain, just the feeling of touching an empty space inside. Like a door that hasn't been oiled for a long time, just moving it makes a tired sigh come out. Walter straightened up, slowly, and turned into the house. Julia was cutting fruit in the kitchen when she heard her father call softly, "Do you have anything to help grease the hinges?" Julia looked at her father and chuckled. "Your knee hinge? Then it's time I told you about glucosamine." Money. Joints don't break down over time, but because we forget to lubricate them. Julia sat down next to her father on the sofa and took out a small jar from the cabinet below the oven. It was clearly labeled glucosamine sulfate, 1500 milliliters. Glucosamine isn't a miracle drug, but it might help Dad hear the click sooner so he can get it fixed. She began to tell him a story slowly, like bedtime stories as a child. You know, inside the knee joint, there is a layer of cartilage that acts as a cushion between the two ends of the bone. It has no nerves, no blood vessels, so when it wears out, your body doesn't notice it right away. But when that cushion gets thinner, the bones rub against each other, and a clicking sound occurs, not because the bone is weak, but because the lining has worn away. Walter sat still. He could picture his knees like old door hinges. Day by day, step by step, the grease between the hinges dried up, screeching with resistance. Glucosamine, Julia continued, is a compound that is naturally present in the body. It is involved in the production of cartilage, synovial fluid, and connective tissue. But after age 50, the body stops producing enough of it, so we need to supply it from outside. Glucosamine doesn't eliminate pain, but it prevents it from becoming chronic. Julia doesn't promise miracles. She doesn't sell illusions. But she believes, as she has done in secret all this time, that if taken regularly, glucosamine will work like a silent cleaner. Unappreciated, unnoticed, cleaning, smoothing, softening every bit of dry, cracked joint. Just take it every morning after eating with a little vitamin C to increase absorption. And remember, Dad, it has to be consistent. Because glucosamine doesn't cure, it rebuilds brick by brick. Walter starts over, a habit as quiet as morning ginger tea. From that day on, his new morning routine, among the fish, oil, collagen, magnesium, and creatine smoothies, now included a opaque white glucosamine pill, a little large but smooth. Julia added to her notebook. Day 59. Added glucosamine. Dad says his knee still clicks, but not as bad as before. 2 weeks later. Day 73. Dad walked up the hill to the pharmacy without stopping. And 1 month later, day 89, Dad carried a 5-kilo box of apples home from the market without complaining about his sore knees. Elderly wisdom. Is knowing how to listen to the whispers from the joints. Walter no longer wishes his knees were as smooth as they were when he was 40, but he has learned to listen for small sounds instead of waiting for big pain, and he knew there was no magic that would make old age easier. Only understanding and perseverance could turn cracks into connections. One afternoon, a long time later, Walter stood in front of the house, preparing to hang the old lantern on the porch. The wind blew gently, carrying with it the smell of pine and smoke from somewhere. He raised his hand, higher than usual, to hook the string to the nail. No crack, no click, just the sound of the wind chimes, clear, even, and unerring. Julia stepped out from behind, book in hand. She looked at her father quietly, not as someone who had just recovered, but as someone who had learned to live proactively with his own body. Dad, I think it's time we talked about second legs. Walter turned back, frowning. What do you mean? Julia smiled. The blood vessels. If the joints are doors, then the blood vessels are the hinges inside. I have lubricated them. Now I have to keep the flow inside unobstructed. Curcumin, anti-inflammatory of ancient wisdom. That evening, the sky was like an indigo roll of tissue paper, silently covering the small town. After dinner, Walter went out into the garden to pick up some dry maple leaves. He loved the feeling of running his hands through the rustling leaves. It was like returning to his youth, to the afternoons of doing gymnastics with the students in the schoolyard. But then, A strange sensation came from the palm of his right hand, like a tiny electric spark running through the tip of his thumb, then down to his wrist, stinging, burning, then a slight sharp pain, as if some small blood vessel had just been squeezed. Walter jerked his hand back. It wasn't excruciatingly painful, but eerily familiar. It was something Helen had described when rheumatoid arthritis began to attack her hands in her later years. Julia was washing dishes in the kitchen when she saw her father pause in the doorway, rubbing his wrist. "What's wrong, Dad? Is your hand numb again?" Walter nodded slightly, not wanting to make a big deal out of it, but Julia's eyes missed nothing. She dried her hands, poured a cup of warm ginger tea, then took from the small drawer next to the collagen bottle a dark brown glass jar with a white label with prominent words, "Nanocurcumin, high absorption anti-inflammatory." The yellow of the earth, but the light for the inflamed body. Julia placed the teacup on the table, then gently stirred the golden curcumin powder into the water. She didn't explain in dry scientific terms, but in a warm voice, like when she told stories to her mother when she was a child. "You know turmeric, right? The kind of root that Mom used to cook with fish to remove the fishy smell." Walter laughed. "My mother uses it for everything from stomach aches to hand scrapes," Julia nodded, "and now I use it for inflammation." "Curcumin, not just a spice, but a silent anti-inflammatory warrior," Julia explained slowly. "No rushing, no lecturing. In turmeric there is an active ingredient called curcumin, but the natural form of curcumin is very difficult to absorb, so I use the nanotype. Extremely small molecules, easily entering the blood, reaching the site of inflammation. Inflammation is not bleeding or swelling. It is something that happens silently, when immune cells lose their way and start to attack healthy tissue. In older people like Dad, smoldering inflammation does not cause him to have a fever. It causes shoulder fatigue, numbness in the arms, aching joints, tingling in the soles of his feet." Walter looked down at his hands. The knuckles were starting to show veins. The skin was as thin as papyrus, but still strong enough to hold a book, lift a cup of tea, and, if not protected in time, fragile enough to collapse from even a small inflammation. From that dinner, every night before going to bed, there was another cup of golden tea. Not sweet, not bitter, just warm. Curcumin enters the body like a drop of sunlight at the end of the day, penetrating the liver, heart, brain, and even small places like the fingertips. It does not give the feeling of no more pain immediately, but Walter finds his hands are less numb when washing dishes, less tired when holding pruning shears, and most importantly, no more tingling in the middle of the night when the temperature suddenly drops. Curcumin and joints, a silent anti-aging duo. Glucosamine fixes hinges. Curcumin prevents rust. Julia wrote this in her diary about taking care of her father, day 98, because for her, recovery is not about rejuvenating, but preventing my father from falling apart further. Every joint, every muscle fiber, every nerve ending. Elderly wisdom is not to wait until it hurts to treat it. Walter used to think inflammation was an old age thing, but now he knows. Inflammation is a warning, not a sentence, and curcumin is a letter of reconciliation between his immune system and his own body. One night, his hand was no longer numb. He wrote a letter by hand for the first time in 10 years. Walter sat in his office, the yellow light shining on his old but bright face. In front of him was a stack of light blue patterned letterhead. Next to him was a fountain pen that he had not used for a long time. Dear Helen, today is the first time I've written to you since you left. It's not because I don't miss you. It's because my hand is no longer strong enough to hold a pen. Until tonight. A letter. A hand that no longer shakes. A 78-year-old man, bravely making peace with the body that once betrayed him. Reikit. When the body no longer overreacts, that's when the heart is at peace. Walter drank curcumin tea every night as a ritual. Not because he feared the pain would return, but because he was grateful for the feeling of no pain. It was something only those who had lost it could understand how sacred it was. And then, the journey doesn't stop. One morning, while shopping with Julia, he suddenly stopped in the frozen aisle. Not because his legs were tired, not because his joints were aching, but because his eyes were blurry. Not tears, but a light mist, like a hazy screen covering the world. Julia turned. She saw what he had not said. "Dad, this time I'm not giving you medicine. I'm giving you lutein, zeaxanthin, and something special you've never heard of, astaxanthin, a red substance from microalgae known as the shield of aging eyes." Everything Mr. Walter has been doing for the past 3 months, taking regular protein, supplementing with omega-3s, collagen, creatine, glucosamine, and now curcumin, is not rejuvenation therapy. They are the therapy that brings him back to himself. Not to go further, but to walk with initiative. Not to run fast, but to not fall. Not to live forever, but to sleep peacefully. That afternoon, as the thin rays of the late winter sun stretched across the damp brick courtyard, Julia stepped out into the taxi waiting outside the gate. Her small suitcase was neatly tucked into the trunk, but the emotions she carried were much heavier, not from the luggage, but from the months she had witnessed her father's quiet resurrection. Walter stood on the porch, his hand raised and waving slightly, but the familiar cane was gone. His back was no longer bent like before. His steps no longer trembled, and his eyes were no longer sad like the day she first returned. Julia looked at her father for a long time before getting into the car. In that brief moment, they didn't need to say anything else. All the most important things had been shared over the past 3 months: recovery, perseverance, understanding, and above all, choice. Old age does not weaken you. Giving up does. Many people think that aging is about slowness, suffering, and dependence, but Walter understands that the decline of the body does not begin in the legs, it begins in the mind. Where we choose to sit instead of walk. Where we choose to endure instead of change. Where we choose later instead of start today. Walter was once a strong man, and then a cramp knocked him flat on the cold kitchen floor. But he was also a man who chose to get up again, not with the strength of youth, but with the wisdom of old age, listening to his body, patiently recovering, and humble in the face of new knowledge. His legs aren't what they were in his 40s, but now they're more precious than ever. They no longer take him on long journeys, but they remain steadfast. Let him walk in the golden autumn afternoon, amidst the scent of lavender and the rustling sound of dry leaves. Let him buy the book himself, and chat with the young employee like a friend. Let him hold his newborn grandson. His hands tremble slightly, but his legs are steady as a milestone in the middle of the yard. Elderly wisdom. It's not about knowing everything, it's about knowing when to start over. Walter chose. Not resigned, even though I thought, this is normal. Don't run away, even though you're afraid you'll fall again. Not silent, even though he knew no one would see the cramp in the middle of the night except him. He chose action. And that action was not as loud as the decisions of youth, but as quiet as the sound of water flowing over stone, eroding away fear, revealing the primitive will within. The wisdom of old age is not to give up, but to listen to your body, and choose the right action at the right time. Every cramp, every difficult step, is a gentle knock on the door reminding you, it's time to take care of your feet. Don't let the silence of your knees turn into a sudden crack. Don't wait until you fall to learn how to get up. If you're 60, 70, or older, and you still get up on your feet every morning, be grateful. But don't stop at gratitude. Take action. Because your legs do more than just help you walk. They help you live with dignity. If you found this story meaningful, please click like and share it with those you love. Don't forget to click subscribe to not miss the next video, where we will expose a truth that everyone ignores. Remember to sub and share the video if you find it meaningful. And don't forget Tomorrow's video will tell a shocking truth.